Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for the State of the Commonwealth Q&A number 1. There's actually going to be a second one as well in about 4 hours' time. So the video has just played, which there was a discussion about quite a few things going on in Australia. There's a lot of misandry in this country, as you probably can see from that video. And the second video actually will be playing a little bit later today. On the panel, we have I see my regular Natalie. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself, Natalie?
Oh, I think everybody knows me by now. You can
no worries. And we've also got
famous one today.
We've also got Bob Jane. So, Bob, would you like to quickly introduce yourself?
Yes, Rob. I've been an attendee of Men's Rights Sydney meetings for a number of years, and I'm very, very passionate about combating androphobia in Australia, which has been a growing problem over the years.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree. That it is a huge and ongoing problem. Bob will not be displaying his video today because part and parcel with the misandry and androphobia that we have in Australia, it can be devastating for people to be outed, to be involved with men's rights. So to me, it's just a personal choice. I'm out with my real name. And that's a personal choice I made nearly 9 years ago. I've lost friends. It has affected me, sort of, if you like, in other ways as well, but not nearly as badly as I think a lot of other people. So we just basically give everyone the opportunity to present either a real or a false name and display their video or not. So I guess the next question is, first of all, do we have any questions from the attendees? And if not, there's a variety of different areas that we can start to talk about. So, Bob, did you want to jump in with androphobia and maybe talk about a little bit the situation in Australia? I think the last time we were having a Q&A, there was some other stuff you wanted to talk about actually, and we weren't able to during that session.
Yeah, just to reiterate about why I'm passionate about androphobia, is that it differs from misandry in the sense that androphobia stresses that it's an irrational fear of men. Like homophobia, except it covers all men, not just gay men, the same sort of thing. Exaggerated fear of harm, exaggerated idea about how privileged men are, and that no one understands also the challenges about living as a male as well. It's a mixed bag. And there's a lot of propaganda in Australia. It's been growing to promote the fear of men, to justify, say, monopolising government funding against domestic violence, to combat domestic violence and so on, and to introduce changes to the law in order to make it easy to, say, convict men of crimes with less evidence or based on a word alone, and so on.
So actually following on this, and Douglas Wallace has just raised a question, and this actually does touch on something that we did talk about. I can't remember if it was actually the first or the second video, and it was something you had some thoughts on, Bob, so I'll read the question. So she says, not really a question, needle spiking in the UK has been completely trashed now. Unfortunately, the news that it is nonsense is heard by very few compared to the huge news that it exists. Does it occur to you to promote the concept that men have less sensitivity, so the main target is men? No, and nobody gives a shit about the facts, so so one option is to just take over the propaganda as much as possible. That's interesting. Do you have any thoughts on that, Natalie and Bob?
I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. So are they suggesting that we combat propaganda with propaganda? I'm not clear. I
think that's, we'll take control of the propaganda, I think is perhaps what Douglas is asking. So our normal approach is to try to combat propaganda with data and so forth. And we know, and there's plenty of studies to support it, that a high proportion of the population aren't really moved by evidence, especially if they're emotionally invested in a particular issue. But Douglas is basically arguing that since this propaganda is out there, why not sort of grab it and say, well, if this is a problem, it's probably happening to men as well. Thoughts, Bob?
Yeah, I do have thoughts. So I consider propaganda to be a negative word. That is, to spread messages for the purpose of manipulating that are usually not based on evidence and facts. So on that definition, I would not want to spread propaganda. what's important to me personally is to have forums where we can safely express views and not be like, punished, cancelled, threatened with violence. That's the important thing. And I see that as a big danger in Australia, to have your career destroyed, to be ostracised unjustly, based on people saying that you're a threat, you're harmful, you're dangerous, just because you're expressing an opinion that's different to what's being expressed by, say, the mainstream media. So the problem now is that no matter where you go in Australia, even in shopping centres, you see propaganda posters promoting androphobia everywhere you go. So I don't think they even have evidence. They're not even well argued. It's just that the way their influence has grown is that on TV, in shopping centres, anywhere, you're constantly bombarded with these messages that try and make you scared of men and so on. So the problem was that I believe that there must have been some point in the past, and let me know if you disagree or whatever, but like at some point in the past, I think men and others thought that, oh, this is just too stupid to be believed. And then during that period of complacency, it grew until this became the position in the mainstream media and in universities and in other organisations that may have been more balanced in the past.
Do you know, I think that there's still widespread complacency. Despite everything we've seen, I think there's still widespread complacency in the community, particularly here in Australia, but also in other countries, in regards to that it's so stupid it couldn't possibly, and I've heard men say it, it's so stupid it couldn't possibly affect the laws, or it's so stupid that nobody believes it. Well, it is affecting the laws, and a growing proportion of the population do believe it. Natalie, do you have any thoughts on Douglas's question about basically grabbing the propaganda and running with it, if I could use that word, versus...
I think when we spoke yesterday to Bettina, and we were talking about how trying to get traction on YouTube, how we can get the message out there through YouTube. So social media is fantastic about getting messages out. But for what we're trying to fight for, we just can't get traction. Yeah. And we talked about, there was one gentleman in America who created a YouTube channel and he does reaction videos, but he does it, he's funny, and he's had me like wet my knickers and all that. But he's since created another YouTube channel which talks about why he sees issues in the world today. And I do despise this word, but the wokeness of it. So I think it's not a matter of complacency. I think it's a matter of a lot of people don't know that there's actually a big community out there that when I first started, or when I tripped over the rabbit hole, I didn't realize it was this big. I didn't realize I was going to be free falling for the rest of my life. Because you learn something new every day, you hear stories every day, and you're just like, oh God, here we go again. And I don't mean that in a derogatory reason. It's sort of like, this is never ending. But I think when it does come to the propaganda that we do see, and I'm using the propaganda word very loosely, that we do see on pop culture, we do see on social media. I think you're right as far as, it's just a flipping comment, until it starts to annoy people. And that's when they might say something, but they don't realize that there's a culture out there, and there is a community out there that is hundreds of millions of people trying to fight for this, for the causes. Because people just don't know. So when you do see a feminist say, typical MRA, it's people just don't realize that what we're actually fighting for, because it's been tarnished with negative connotation because of feminists.
We've even had a host of this conference suggest that the men's rights movement was a mirror image of feminism. I think that caused a couple of people's jaws to drop, but we've actually had a host at this conference say that. So I just wanted, Douglas has actually made another comment, which I think is a good one. I'm going to just respond to Douglas's first question about first. So me personally, no, I won't be doing that, because I'm very much a facts and figures guy. And if you look at Wiki for Men, I've put up a lot of data there, for example, on AVFM. If you look at my articles, there's a lot of citations and so forth. I will not be doing that, because I've researched looked into the topic of the needle spiking in the UK industry, and it's also come up here recently. It's been claimed that, as you suggest, it's just not happening. And there was a UK university, a hospital that I'm sure you're probably aware of, that actually studied the topic and found that really the women who were claiming this were principally over consuming alcohol and then looking for a way out. Is pretty much what it amounted to. So I will not be grabbing their propaganda and going with it. I'll be continuing to try to discredit their propaganda. Now, I believe in a multi-pronged approach. There are other people doing things other than me. There's a lot. I hear a lot of people say we should do this, we should do that, particularly outside our community. What I found is the multi-pronged approach, I think, works well. There are people doing things differently than I'm doing them, and I think that actually they can complement each other. Now, if you look at Paul Illam, a friend of mine, he really kicked down the door for the rest of us to walk through. There were others too, but really Paul was the one I think who really kicked the door in and we could pour through. Now, Paul was very careful to stick to the facts. I'm not in any way suggesting that he ever misrepresented it, because he didn't. He was very careful, but he has a talent to frame things in a way which sounds outrageous. So he'll say something which is actually true and say it in a way which is outrageous and cause feminists for steam to start coming out of their ears. Absolutely fabulous. But his approach is different to mine. And he and I have talked about this, and we pretty much agree that his method opened the door for my method. So personally, I will not be doing that. I will not be taking their propaganda and doing anything with it. I will continue to try to discredit it. But there are other people who can perhaps do satirical articles and whatnot and maybe approach it in a different way, and that's perfectly fine. So, okay, fair enough. You said Richard Doyle kicked my door in. Yeah, fair enough. I mean, in terms of it going into that and really hitting the mainstream. There were people obviously before Paul, but I think he really got people talking in a negative way. There was a lot of anger and so forth that directed in his direction. So, okay. So Douglas's next question, though, he says, again, not really a question. There was a conversation on violence when Robert thought that things were worse in Australia. I don't mean to downplay the problems in Australia, but things are worse in Asia, particularly bad in India. Yep, very good point. I suppose implicitly I'm talking about the West or comparable cultures, so I probably should clarify that. Yes, and I will certainly not downplay the problems in Asia or India. My only regret is that I haven't had enough time to talk about those issues. In actual fact, following this ICMI, there's a few issues in Asia and India I really want to get stuck into. Off topic for Australia, but I'll mention there are, a lot of people don't know, the Thai fishing fleet is full of enslaved men. So the men, usually from poorer countries like Laos, go to Thailand to look for work. They're tricked onto a ship. They're taken out into the sea. These fishing boats in some cases, don't return to land for months or years. They have sort of larger ships that come out, collect the fishing catch, which then go back to shore. While the two ships are docked at sea, they chain the men to the deck, okay? And they can't escape. They can't even stow away on the larger ship to try to get back to land. They don't see land for years. They're sometimes sleeping only 4 hours a day. That's the Thai fishing fleet. And here in Australia, a fairly high proportion of seafood we're seeing comes from Southeast Asia and so forth. And we've got to bear in mind that this is being driven by slavery. And that is a problem. That particular one is one I really want to talk about in the future. So I absolutely take your point, Douglas. Yes, you be trying to raise awareness in the UN. Fabulous, excellent. I have seen it mentioned occasionally in the UN and other places, but nobody seems to want to run with it. But I love that idea, and I think I'd like to talk to you about that after the conference, actually.
I'm shocked. I haven't heard
I've
this
spoken a
mentioned
bit there.
once.
I'll let you guys go. Sorry, go on.
No, I haven't heard this mentioned once in the Australian media. Well, not once.
No.
Okay, what
That's-
I'd like to do, because Douglas is aware of this in the UN.
So I understand, I don't know what Douglas's exact role is, but I understand Douglas is involved in the UN in some way. So I think he's trying from the inside, trying to affect change, which is why, as we talked about in the previous session, we're going to connect a few people after the conference with connections in the UN and see what we can do.
Douglas, I think we spoke earlier, Rob and I run a YouTube and Facebook channel called The Tackle Box. Would love to have you on to discuss this issue.
That would be fabulous, actually. Absolutely.
So I'm just putting it out there, just so.
Absolutely. So I'm just seeing if we have any more questions. Otherwise, there's always plenty of topics.
Yeah.
To
if there isn't a question, I actually had a follow-up comment to make on something Natalie said a little bit earlier.
I'm sorry.
What was that, Bob? Go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, Natalie just mentioned people who have an open mind or people who are sympathetic to the idea of men's issues. They're often, people feel alone, like they're the only people that feel that way. They're a minority. They don't realize there's a lot of people.
Yes.
And I see that as a connection to YouTube's recent action to remove public dislike counts on videos. So there's a lot of talk about why they did that. But I think one of the reasons why they did that was that that was one of the remaining democratic options and uncensorable options for people to express that they disagree with an ideology presented by video. And I think by removing that dislike count, they wanted people to feel alone. Perhaps wanted people to feel alone, that they were a minority.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. In fact, is anybody supporting that? Because for those who don't know, maybe not everybody watches YouTube as much as we do. Like Bob said, they've removed you can still have a like count, so you can see how many people like a video, but you can no longer see how many people dislike the video. The video owner can still see it, but viewers can't. So the data is still there in the database. Does anybody like it? Because as far as I can tell, everybody dislikes this. Is there any report of anybody who's happy with it? I don't think so.
Yeah. I just go with the flow.
No, it's all right. It's all right. We've got another question coming in here. Oh, Douglas, great. Okay. So as a Briton, I have long had huge respect for the men in Australia and New Zealand. This is partly based on my appreciation of the brave part they took in the 2 world wars, but it's supported by those men I have met in the UK. I hear that 4% have marched, didn't know that, but I have wondered why Australians put up with their tyrannical government. Okay, all right. Bob, do you want to start on that?
Yes, I have a very strong opinion on this. I think that it's one of the problems with Australian culture is that we'll have a shield be right attitude. Things might seem bad right now, but they'll just somehow eventually work themselves out and everything will be okay. And I think this cultural attitude is the cause of much complacency.
And it's if I could just jump in there, I don't know if you have more to say about it. Australia has, since its really early days, the 1830s or something along those lines, been among the more prosperous places in the world. I mean, it's a net exporter of food. There's been a high standard of living here for a very long time, and that's picked up particularly in the last few decades. So I think this does promote that attitude too, that if we just sort of keep doing what we've been doing, things will be okay. And because in a lot of cases they have been okay. But just, as you're suggesting, I think that if there's a problem, we've got that she'll be right attitude, and we may just let things slide. I don't know if you had more to comment there.
Yeah, I mean, I know in the history, having read Australian history, that we had a lot of civil disobedience in the past, a glorious history of civil disobedience. But I think, as you mentioned, the prosperity of the last decades have made people just be happy with their creature comforts and, forget about standing up for like individual liberties and government oppression.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those who don't know, Australia, it's had bad periods like every other country. The 1970s was a difficult period in Australia as it was in the UK. But from the 1990s onwards, the Australian standard of living has risen rapidly, past the US and so forth, wealth, and has passed the US. And I think people in the last particularly 30 years have really grown quite complacent. I did hear an interesting comment once. Now, everybody knows that Australia was founded as a penal colony, right? It's often, when I lived overseas, people love to ask me if it's true. Yes, it's true. I heard an interesting quote recently. Australians are not just descended from convicts, we're also descended from their jailers. And I think that's an interesting comment in relation to how Australia views things like, and I think probably Douglas is partly talking about lockdowns and so forth. So Natalie, did you want to comment at all?
No.
Oh, okay. No worries at all.
And it's only because I'm in Victoria, so our government for the last 2 years has just been under fire. So,
right. So a bit of local knowledge.
So I abstain from this question because
fair enough.
There's other issues that are going on with the Victorian government.
A bit of local knowledge. Bob, are you okay if I disclose what state you live in?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, no, I
said men's rights Sydney, so that's not a secret. It's New South Wales.
No, good, thanks. So basically, Australia is a federal state. It's very easy to forget that. It's that the Australian Constitution is actually based largely on the US Constitution, believe it or not. But our states have been losing power in for the last 100 years or so, just because of the way the Constitution is written, actually. But anyway, they've had something of a resurgence since 2020. What's happened is that each state the states have taken the lead in addressing COVID-19. Now, the state I live in, Queensland, was the first one to lock down, and first one to really make a very strong lockdown. It shocked a lot of other people, and there was a lot of negative publicity about it and so forth, but it really sort of set the model. We've experienced a lot less problems with COVID-19 over this period. Life has largely been normal here to a large degree. We had a couple of months where we had to, have excuses to leave the house and so forth. But other than that, we've largely lived a normal life. In contrast, Natalie is in Victoria, near the city of Melbourne. Now, Melbourne, I believe, managed to be the longest lockdown of any city in the world as of a few weeks ago. So there's a huge contrast there. Bob's in New South Wales. Both New South Wales and Victoria had by Australian standards, large blowouts of numbers. They were always low by international standards, but by local standards, they were quite high. They both had quite long periods of lockdown. So the Australian experience is very much a state-based experience, is where I'm going with that. Now, having said that, my view is that in the early days of COVID-19, we didn't really know what we were up against. If you think about the early days, they were talking about, does it affect the kidneys? Does it cross the blood-brain barrier and affect the brain? Nobody knew. So I think initially, lockdowns made sense. And then I think the politicians got themselves locked into a kind of pattern, which they found very hard to get out of. And so the response to a problem was to lock down. And I think this has been the problem. There's the question now is, because as we know, once a government gets a power, they're much more, it's much easier to give a government a power than just to get it off them. So now that they've demonstrated this, what happens in the next 5 to 10 years? Do they continue to lock down for various reasons? Do the Australian people continue to tolerate that? And I would suggest with a 4% marching already, I think we'll probably hopefully see Australians will start to stand up. There was a lot of understanding with lockdowns up to this point, but tempers are fraying now. So I think if we're still looking at lockdowns 6 months from now, I think we'd see a very different situation in Australia in terms of response from the population.
Just so you know what it's like in Victoria, I've been working from home. I think I've said this in the past. Work for a big company, beautiful building in the city. I've got a great view. But I've been working from home since April last year. And I've been at the company for 3 years now. And I've been working from home longer than from what I've worked in the office since I've been here. Yeah. So that's sort of the understanding. I did move from one part of Melbourne literally to the other side of Melbourne during lockdown. Outside of lockdown, but still within the last 18 months. And since I've moved, I've had the freedoms to go as far as I want. Being in lockdown, I haven't been able to move out of 5 kilometres. I think there was a point there where I didn't leave the house for 2 months. So it's just, yeah, for me, as far as the government goes, I understand a lot of people's frustration. I understand the protesters. I have said quite clearly, I will never forgive them for marching on the shrine. So in Melbourne, we have the Shrine of Remembrance, which is the pinnacle of remembrance for our heroes that have gone to war. So I will never forgive them for that. That's where they lost sympathy for me. Not that I necessarily continue to back up the government. I didn't. Just the protesters lost a lot of people on that day.
Yeah. So I guess by way of cultural background, I mean, the Anzacs, the Australian New Zealand Army Corps, is something that in Australian culture, it really, you just don't touch. If you want to annoy the entire country, disrespect the Anzacs. So yeah, I think perhaps, as you say, marching on the shrine and so forth, that's going to get a lot of people offside. So and that's something that's widespread in the Australian culture. Probably, perhaps, I mean, the UK suffered heavily in both world wars. I imagine it's probably fairly similar there. So Douglas has mentioned the COVID concentration camps in Australia. So does anyone want to comment on that? I know we're off topic a little bit with men's rights, but hey,
yeah, that's why I want to. I want to avoid straying onto this topic because I could have passionate discussions about many aspects of that, and I didn't want to fragment the audience, by.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. Yeah, I guess I probably only have one quick comment on it, that we have mandatory detention for illegal immigrants who come to Australia, and this has been something that even the UN has called Australia out on and so forth, and they've been called hellholes and so forth. And interestingly enough, during an emergency evacuation of Australians coming back to Australia, a couple 6 or 12 months ago, they had to put Australians in one of the immigration detention centres temporarily. And it was, funnily enough, it just struck me as odd that many of them actually said how nice the facilities were, and nobody in the media sort of commented on that. It's a real contrast to the message we've been getting about those facilities. So I think the term concentration camp is fairly emotive. I personally wouldn't use it. I'm not necessarily in favour of those facilities. I think that putting people in hotels if you have to and generating revenue for hotels was probably a much better idea. It was Queensland that championed the idea of the hotels. I actually think probably home detention for people who would have been a better way of doing things, but they didn't. They actually wanted to discourage people crossing borders, and that's why they did it. So otherwise, let's move on, I suggest. Yeah, there are many other topics for us to talk about in Australia. Bob or Natalie, do you want to suggest something, or someone from the audience? Otherwise, I'll leap in with something.
Bob, please go ahead. You're our guest.
No.
Yeah. Just I don't have anything right on hand this moment. I'm sure I will in a few more seconds, but
No worries.
I see one issue that's fragmenting the feminists is the participation of transgender athletes in sporting competitions. And it's fascinating to watch that, especially in the case of recently a swimmer. What do they call Leah?
Yes.
The name will come back to me in a moment. But they recently won a swimming competition and they beat the next biological female swimmer by, I think, 40 seconds. More like almost like 1.5 to 2 laps ahead. And I can see that there are very strong passions about that.
Absolutely. I don't know if anyone in the audience wants to jump in with a comment there. So I may be having a bit of a problem looking at Q&A questions at the moment. Natalie, can you keep an eye on that?
No, we're not getting a lot in. I grew up surrounded by a lot of great gay people, transgender, drag queens, all that. So I've supported in them they're being who they want to be. That's fine. However, there are certain aspects I disagree with. Just, there you go, Bob, it was Leah Thomas.
Okay.
Just because you identify as a specific gender, and I'll support you and call you by the correct pronoun, or try to call you by the correct pronoun. If I do slip up, it's a slip up, not
transphobia.
Yeah. But I can remember even as far back, I think it was the late 90s, early 2000s, where a man gave birth to a child. It wasn't a man, it was a transgender female. Part of me being a woman is having ovaries. You know, it doesn't matter how you transition, how a male transitions into a female, they're still not going to have ovaries. They're never going to have their period. They're never going to go through PMS, and they're never going to go through what I'm going through now, which is the hot flushes. You know, my 50 years are up and it's all going, my ovaries are now useless. You can't, just because it's how you identify, you can't think that the rest of the world, it's not going to understand, but you're still biologically this. Full transition, full, hormone replacement therapy, everything. If you go through everything and you're still 100% female, and you become 100% female, you still got that gene in you that makes you male, as far as stronger, faster, the bone density that we were talking about the other day.
They've enjoyed that. So if somebody were to transition, say at 30, they've enjoyed that from puberty to 30. The testosterone has benefited them in a number of ways. And even though they're now taking estrogen and suppressing testosterone, they've still benefited from the testosterone.
And there's even, so we've had Anne Whittaker come on, and when not on our show, we've had her during ICMI. When she was on Big Brother, there was a woman called India, I nearly forgot her name, that transitioned from male to female. And I've seen interviews with her since, and she agrees that transgenders shouldn't go for, it's not fair for transgender females to go for sports against other women.
I wonder if we should just start, what do they call it with horse racing when they put a weight on the horse to, temporarily forgotten the term, sorry.
But not handicap, is it?
Handicapping, thank you. So I wonder if we should just handicap trans athletes. Maybe that's the solution. I actually haven't heard anyone mention that.
Well, they claim they are. Some of them claim that they are handicapped as a result, and that should make up for any advantage they had from growing up as men.
Yeah, what I mean is apply like time penalties or something like that to them. So
it's a can of worms, because then you'd have big debates on what the appropriate time would be and who should get it and so on. I mean, this whole thing was a can of worms anyway, and so I can't see anything that can make the can any smaller.
So Douglas just pointed out that Eric Anderson's talk in ICMI's Transgender Athletes in Sport. Yes, as a result of my ICMI responsibilities, I haven't had a chance to watch it yet, unfortunately. Thank you very much for that, Douglas. Actually, that will be a good one to watch. Just looking at the time here, seeing how we're going. So we've talked about a few issues. We've talked about things that you could argue off topic, although they're still related to Australia. I just wanted to briefly bring up a topic near and dear to my heart. The Workplace Gender Equality Agency. Now, Douglas, I do take your point about problems being very bad in other countries. When I talk about, certainly in comparison to the West, I often view Melbourne and Toronto as sort of I call them the SJW capitals of the world. And I think the two cities, Melbourne, the capital of Victoria here, and Toronto in Canada, and Toronto, Ontario. And I call them the SJW capitals of the world. And I think they're really fighting it out to see which one is worst. And just personally, and I find this immensely amusing, I was born just outside Melbourne and I've lived in Toronto. So I've managed to live in both of the SJW capitals of the world. So I'm really impressed by that. But in terms of the Western world, at least, how it exhibits in each country, I think, is a little bit different. And what we do see certain problems in the West, they're different to the problems in the developing world. But yes, the developing world absolutely has its own very serious issues, as we said. But I wanted to move on to the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. So this is a federal government department. I did briefly talk about it in one of the presentations. The WGEA is a government department that basically is supposed to watch gender equity, as they like to say in Australia. And I'm not sure that the UK or the US or Canada have a federal government department or have a government department whose job it is to maintain this in the manner that, or to report on it in the manner that the WGEA does. There's an amusing photo that circulates of WGEA. I need to live in Stockholm next. Oh dear. Yes, I think I might just pass. I might just pass on Stockholm. Thank you. There's a photo of the staff of the WGA. Now, remember, they're talking about women being as a minority in senior positions and roles and so forth. And somebody circulated a photo of the WGEA staff and then circled all the men. And it's about 30 staff, so it's not a large department. And there might have been some missing from the photo, but it's somewhere around there. It's a small department. But there were 3 or 4 men. There was one person you couldn't quite tell whether they were male or female in the picture, but they were a bit covered. But so we had less, probably 10% male was probably about what it looked like. And I've interacted with the WGEA on a number of occasions, and I talked about that in the presentation, so I won't go over that. But it's not just federally supported, we have an actual government department that is doing this for us. That's how entrenched feminism is in the Australian government. It's absolutely extraordinary.
Oh, Douglas, you got me scared. Like, I thought there would be nothing worse than Melbourne. It's scary here. You've got, okay, I don't know. I understand that the word bogan's very much New Zealander and Australian word. I think in America it'd be like white trailer trash redneck. Don't know what it would be in England, and I come from England.
Chav, maybe.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, maybe. Australia. The 2 suburbs that I've moved between. This is actually a great example. The 2 suburbs I moved between is I was too bogan for one, and I'm not bogan enough for another one. So, like, I'm too hipster where I am now, and I wasn't hipster enough in the other one. So it's like you've got these clash of bogans, not clash.
All the non-Australians have no idea what a bogan is.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the other words.
Like I said, Chad wasn't.
But you've got bogans and hipsters in Melbourne. You're either one or the other. And then there's me who like is split, like literally doing the splits between the two.
A few years ago, this is actually, so I think I did mention this in the Q&A. Natalie and I have known each other for a few years, but we physically met when I flew down to Melbourne to speak at the March for Men. And there's a very particular reason why that city was chosen to hold that march. And Victoria Police absolutely had to surround us to protect us so that we could actually have our speeches and have our event. And there were probably, I don't know how many, 50, 60, 70 police there. It was quite
I think it was much more than that. Because
probably more. It was quite
we had a Federation Square. If anybody's been to Federation Square, we were basically surrounded to the point where it felt like there was more police there than there was us.
So I think Victoria Police took it very seriously, and from the interest of freedom of speech, they made sure that we got to have our event, which we did thank them for that. That was great.
Oh, they were fantastic that day. I could not praise them enough.
So we've got a few more minutes on this one. We'll be running another session. There'll be another presentation on the State of the Commonwealth in about 3 hours, and then another Q&A in about 4 from the beginning of this one. And so we'll be finishing up in a few minutes. But does anyone have any final questions or thoughts? Yes, Bob.
Yes. Something I did come to mind. The Professionals Australia Women in STEM Survey for 2021. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah. Do you want to make some comments on that?
Yes, they produced a report talking about the status of women in the STEM fields in Australia. So for those who don't know, Professionals Australia used to be known as PESMA, the Association for Professional Engineers, Scientists and Managers or something like that. But now they're simply called Professionals Australia, and they're like a trade union. And they released their report, and once again, I'm going to use that word, I call it androphobic propaganda. They went on about a massive gender pay gap, which was, of course, they misrepresented the causes caused by differences in hours worked, differences in, because of taking time away from your career to start a family. And of course, differences in the type of job, the seniority of your position and so on. And once again, they just use this to try and bash men and call for special privileges. But they don't openly say that in order to close the gap, they're effectively wanting women to be paid more per hour than men, because that's the main way to close this apparent gap. But it does not exist, as has been proven many times independently. This gap does not exist if you compare equivalency of seniority, hours, pay per hour worked, and so on.
Exactly.
As I said,
Go on. Yeah.
The other propaganda trick they use in this report is there are reports of women's experiences of discrimination in the workplace, and they are real. They are very real. I have no reason to doubt that they are real. Things like having say a woman who came up with a new idea, a new innovation, had it stolen, appropriated by someone more senior. And I agree that is something that definitely happens. And another time where people say their voices weren't heard, or people who were better connected got the promotion and they didn't. The logical fallacy they did is they did not survey men in the field to ask how often that happens to them. Because I assure you, there are men who have their ideas stolen, men who are not part of the right circles, who do not get promoted, and so on. So they turn problems that affect everyone into gender-based problems. One of the oldest standard tricks to manufacture this outrage.
Yep, and by not asking men, that's right, the data doesn't even exist, so we can't even respond with data to counter their data because there isn't any.
And the risk is, if you're a man in STEM who tries to argue against this, they'll call you a misogynist, saying that you want women to stay in the kitchen and so on. It won't do you any favors to speak about it openly.
Well, there was a study a few years ago, not Australian, that showed that, I think it made, I can't recall actually where the study was undertaken, but they found a significant hiring benefit for women, or advantage for women in STEM fields, where it appeared particularly male managers were preferencing women over men for hiring, and it was estimated to be 2 to 1. So there was really a significant difference that they were seeing. And interestingly, I saw quite a number of feminists applaud this. Now, if they were really interested in legal and social equality of women and men, they would be objecting to this, because they would not want either gender to have an advantage or a bias over the other. But when women get the advantage, that's just fine.
Yes, and they get legal exemptions against discrimination legislation. Like that's now common, that they can advertise for female-only positions legally. It used to not be legal, but they give them waivers saying there's a special need in STEM fields to have increased representation of women.
Yeah, for those who don't know, that's actually happened in Australia. We've got a number of documented cases just recently where they have done that. We've queried them on it, and they've got exemptions on it. They have released positions. This is state governments have done it, city councils, which are part of the state government, and universities have done it recently as well, where they've opened positions only to women, and men need not apply.
Okay, before we go, I've got a quick one from Douglas. STEM in the UK excludes the entire medical field, as though medical field has nothing to do with science, technology or engineering.
Yes.
Then you've got in brackets, and the medical doctors spend a while on mathematics studies. Is this the case in Australia?
So you're saying, Douglas, that they're excluding the medical field from the calculations so as to make it appear there are less women in STEM?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Actually, that's a really good question. I'm not sure whether that's occurring in Australia, and that's a really good question. And
I say yes. I'm going to say firm yes.
Yep, fair enough. I'm going to find out.
Women are very well. I think that might even be now the majority in new medicine.
Oh, absolutely. Women were, I think, a majority of medical. When I went the university I went to, the medical course, I didn't do medicine, obviously, but I think they were a majority then, or it was a parity then. So absolutely, they're a majority now, and in vet science as well. Vet science has gone.
Certain careers that appeal to women more than being a scientist or an engineer.
Yeah,
and that's
vet science.
Vets, doctors, architects. Women are very well represented.
Yeah, vet science has gone overwhelmingly male to overwhelmingly female in about 30 to 40 years. It's really interesting, actually. So where you've just seen this absolute flip from one to the other, and as you say, there are other fields as well where we're seeing that sort of thing. But it is really quite interesting how this has occurred.
So they draw the lines. They just draw the lines, jagged lines, to create the illusion of a problem, to justify these extreme measures that discriminate against men.
Yes, I'm going to confirm that for Australia, and I think that's something I'll be putting on Wiki for Men in the near future. So we are just about at time. So thank you very much, everybody. As I said, there'll be another presentation on the state of the Commonwealth later today, and another Q&A in a few hours. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.